Welcome to the HR Uprising podcast. This podcast series explores HR hot topics and challenges through conversations with relevant experts and real-life HR, learning, and OD professionals. The HR Uprising is about learning through collaboration and evidence-based action. We want colleagues to have the confidence and skills to rise up through their organizations by delivering real, lasting business value. Now, introducing your host, chartered psychologist, experienced change agent, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach, Lucinda Carney.
Hello, this is Lucinda Carney from the HR Uprising podcast. And I'm really pleased to have somebody here today who's going to help me with a topic that I didn't really know how to address, but I passionately wanted to share some quality information to the listeners on this topic. The topic I'm talking about now is whether or not we're at a tipping point regarding racial equality. How do we get comfortable feeling uncomfortable? And I came across this gentleman through a fantastic LinkedIn blog that he published last week, which I will put in the show notes because I think everyone should get a chance to read it. And this gentleman has kindly agreed to come on the podcast to take us through a kind of masterclass on this, how we can practically and authentically do something about moving this agenda forward. So I'm very grateful to have Umar Zamman. He's the Chartered Fellow of the CIPD. He's the Director of Human Resources and Organisational Development at Sheffield Hallam University. He's also involved internationally in HR and has a variety of HR and OD roles, so a rich background, which I know you're going to bring to the podcast. So Umar, let me hand over to you to also introduce yourself and why you felt you wanted to put your blog out there and progress this conversation.
Thank you, Lucinda. It's a real pleasure to be invited onto this podcast. So in terms of myself, my background, I've been in HR and organisational development for a number of years, and I've had a balance between quite public sector roles, both nationally and at a local level. But I have worked in organisations such as the Home Office, Her Majesty's Inspector for Constabulary. I've done some time, as you call it, in the NHS. So I've had the pleasure of, I suppose, working as they were the primary care trusts, leading HR, OD, and diversity. And then in the higher education sector as well. But I have done consultancy work both here in the UK and internationally as well. I do try and do different things, and I think that that's what's given me a kind of wide breadth of understanding of different sectors, and specifically the HE sector where I am now. I really do enjoy it because it enables me to really challenge my own thinking. I have academic colleagues and other colleagues who really challenge my thinking, and it really is a great place to be. So so one of the reasons I wrote the blog, and if you do get a chance to read it, you'll read at the start to say, would I have written this if I had been in any other organisation? Would I have felt comfortable? And the answer is most probably no. In terms of what I wrote, I didn't expect the response that I was going to get. I just wrote a blog and just put it out there. But I felt so strongly, and I have felt strongly about this for years, that, we talk about the glass ceiling for women. And I just find that when we talk about race, things get diverted and diluted. And absolutely, I've been a gender champion for years. But for me, the time was right to be very honest about my experiences. And my experiences, both in personal life and in my career, have been a true battle. Getting to director level for some is a challenge, and sometimes people get there quite easily. It has been a real hard challenge to be able to get there, and more than happy to try and talk through.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can you help us? Because again, I don't know whether people recognise how that comes about, or they would probably be unaware of that. Many people would. Yeah,
well, I think the thing is that I've had to move around a number of organisations to progress my career, and part of that is because structurally organisations will tend to have people who they favour, who they push through, who they see as talent. And, you know, for me, I used to go and work for lots of organisations, and I thought, you know, oh, this sounds like a good job, I'll go and do it. I think as you get a bit older, you start to realise that it becomes a battle, and you want to work in an organisation which values you for who you are. And that's where I am at the moment. You know, getting opportunities doesn't come easy, and the times I've had said to me, you're just not quite there yet. You know, you know, and I'm kind of looking at them thinking, well, I kind of know that, but that's why I'm going for the job, because, you know, I want to get experience to get into that, but I've got lots of stuff that I do bring to the role.
That's a face doesn't fit thing, and that would happen to women as well, I guess. And because it's a non-specific bit of feedback, as it's not, you know, this specific behavioural competency. It's that you can't help but feel that is, you just don't fit in the club when you get that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that it's when you go to an interview. Over the years, I have been to interviews, and I've known as soon as I've walked in, I'm just not going to. I'm not getting this job. And for me, I've always tried to be driven to get to a senior position. But overall, it's the subtleties that you just can't quite put your finger on. And for me, it's the micro level paper cuts that I call, which are the most damaging, because, you know, when I've gone for jobs, I've known I've been qualified, I've known I've got the experience, and it has been that your face won't fit. But then you've got the other angle, which is internally when people are given opportunities, where actually it matters who you are interacting with, what the networks are. And I learned that very late in my career, that actually networking is extremely important. And I think that comes a little bit from my background, from my South Asian background of, you know, just get your head down, work as hard as you can, and things will happen. Mm. And part of me believes that, but part of me also believes you've got to work twice as hard. And I think that's a common theme you'll find with a lot of people in career, sports, from BAME backgrounds.
That I can understand as well. Maybe it links, it's not overt, but it's to do with the fact that if you're not part of the club, whether you choose to actively be part of it outside of work, and again, sorry, I'm linking a female where we might use the term old boys club or something. If you're not part of the lads that go out and do things, and this is not at all, I'm not interested in being sort of negative people. It's just things that I think I have experienced that way. I think, well, they kind of naturally want to talk about football and blah, blah, blah. Then I suppose you don't have that level of rapport if you then went for the job. So you're not top of the list. So, so that's something I can see. There's a logic to how that behaves. And again, equally, if you're somebody who just doesn't choose to engage with the in crowd, then you might not get the opportunities.
Yeah. I completely get where you're coming from. In my blog, I give an example of cricket, for example.
Yeah, and share that. It's so
I was very young when I wanted to become a professional cricketer. And you look back now and you think, actually, I don't drink. I never been going to pubs. That's not my type of thing. And you just weren't part of that crowd. Yeah. But I suppose if you refer it back to the workplace, talent comes in all different forms. And I think great leaders are those that actually see talent in different ways. And they believe that, diversity brings a different way of working and thinking. And I can name in my head, some of the great leaders I've worked with who gave me opportunities actually. And actually they weren't BAME, they were white, senior colleagues, but actually the interesting thing is they understood some of the challenges. So I will go back to a point when I worked at Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary. There's a chap called Sir Ronnie Flanagan, an ex-Chief Constable in Northern Ireland, understood the troubles in Northern Ireland, and he asked me to come and work on the government review of policing. A huge opportunity due to a bit of work that I'd done. And he really understood the issues. He got that. And sometimes you do get that lucky break. So not everybody is like that. And I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that structural racism does exist.
Yeah.
And I think this whole movement that started with the sad death of George Floyd in America. George Floyd sadly wasn't the first person to die in custody. We had somebody a couple of months back who died in custody here in the UK. Didn't even really make the news. I think that's where I thought, we are at a tipping point, because the whole world literally was talking about Black Lives Matter.
So, and I'd love to. We'll go forwards in terms of the structure. We're going to talk about practicalities and what happens in terms of this. I'd love to just go back to, you use that term, the paper cuts. Because we might be using that. I might be using terms like that, which might, could you give us examples of those sort of things?
Yeah, sure. So,
wear you down.
So I call it a death by 1,000 paper cuts. You can get a couple and they're painful, but you kind of forget about them in 10 minutes. But if you get them every single day, then they become very, very painful. So examples of such I can give you are things like, looking for a good place to have a curry tonight. You'll know where that is. You tell me. As it happens, I do like curry, but that's not the point. The point is that actually, if you ask one of my staff this, and not to mention his name, he's from an Asian background, but he doesn't eat curry. He's been brought up in Oxford, went to Cambridge, so that wasn't his thing, so there's stereotyping. But the other thing is, you get those subtle hints from people. You walk into a meeting and you're the only person who's different there, of colour, and there's just that feeling. You think, oh my God. But actually, you can't let anybody know that's how you're feeling. And it becomes quite difficult whereby, I've been in meetings before where you say something, and this is most probably unconscious. You've just said an idea, and then somebody else says it, it's ignored, but somebody else says it, and suddenly it's taken on board. And you're sitting thinking, I just said that. So I think when we talk about those types of microaggressions, they do exist. I think the other type of microaggression is when you are trying to progress in your career and you're constantly being told, no, you need some more experience. You need to do this. You need to do that. And you take it on board, but actually it does get to a point where it becomes very, very taxing. And unless you've been through it, I don't think it makes sense to people.
If you said to them, because I'm sure given the area that you're in, if people said that to you and you said, so what is it I need to do? So you would have gone back and challenged that. What response were you getting there? Well,
I think part of it, you're in a way, it depends where you are in your career. Would I have written this 5 years ago? No. And the reason I would not have written this 5 years ago is because it was a very slight different time, and this would most probably go against me going for certain jobs
against you.
Organisations.
Yeah.
But actually, I've now got to a point where I wouldn't want to work for those organisations anyway. But when you're trying to progress in your career and people say that to you, you've been taught all your life that actually people in authority in jobs, whatever they're saying is right. And it becomes very difficult to challenge. So what you end up doing is a lot of organisations tend to lose their black and ethnic minority staff, and their turnover is quite high. And then they wonder, why is our turnover so high here? So what happens is it gets projected on the individual. Now, this is a bit of a generalisation, but there is a high turnover in lots of organisations from BAME staff. Exit interview data is not really taken as seriously as it should be. You've been in HR as well, Lucinda, we'll have exit interviews and, oh, yes, seen as somebody being a little bit sour grapes or whatever. But actually, I think that information is the golden nuggets for HR professionals, whether you agree with it or not.
Well, sometimes people don't want to listen to those answers because then there's an obligation to maybe do something about it.
Yeah, well, you don't want to hear things that you don't want to hear. And then I think actually organisations sleepwalk into major problems.
I'm also thinking there, again, I'm not quite saying this is devil's advocate. I'm just thinking that if you are somebody where you feel that you've been discriminated against before and you've gone on to the next role and you've got a manager who's just not very good at giving performance feedback, and they say, well, you're not quite there, someone else might challenge them and they might still give you something nonsense, and someone confident, and they go, oh, well, they're just useless. That's their problem, right? But if you have experienced repetitive discrimination, then you're more likely to think that it's personal. Is that reasonable? I was thinking, what I can't say is whether it's an unconscious bias or a conscious bias. It might genuinely be that manager hasn't got a bias against you. They're just not very good at developing people.
You have some people who are just poor managers. You have people who are genuinely haven't got a discriminatory bone in their body, but they just do not know how to interact with people, and emotional intelligence comes into it. I think that's huge. But then, and I'm not saying this happens all the time, so I don't want listeners to think that this is the experience all the time, because there's been some really great experiences as well. But we do agree, the halo horn effect, in terms of, as soon as you see somebody, you have an instant kind of recognition with them. And it also depends, in my view, my experience, this is my personal experience, of where you're working. So if you're working in a city where there's been diversity and people are used to it, there's a slightly different feel. I'm in Sheffield at the moment, for example. And it was really powerful because I got an email from our Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Chris Husbands, who I work with very closely. And I said to him, I have a sense of belonging here. And I think he just thought about that for a minute. But actually, that's a big thing for me, to have that sense of belonging. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect place. There's lots to do there and so on. But you don't feel out of place. And I can't explain it. I can't put an explanation on it.
We need to know. We need to be able to bottle it. What's the secret?
Well, I think the point is that, and those people, and it might even be, women, people with disabilities, who will say the same thing, that they feel comfortable with being who they are. And we've got the same thing with LGBT colleagues at Hallam. Where another colleague of mine, James Johnston, just wrote an article around pride, and and it was open, honest, and for me that's a real temperature test of an organisation, of how comfortable people are. Because I've been in organisations whereby if you say this type of stuff, you're branded as a trouble causer potentially.
So it sounds like there's something open and accepting about the culture, and you're seeing other people of difference feel able to speak out about being different, and that being supported by the university. I mean, we spoke earlier that I think the Twitter or Hallam, I saw them picking up on your blog and supporting it. So almost being proud about it as opposed to tolerating it. So celebrating difference rather than tolerating it. Yeah. And so I wonder, what's the opposite of a micro paper cut? So are there micro positives then that you see in a positive environment? Maybe that would be an example of someone putting something out on social media and it being reinforced. You said you've got a strong relationship with your professor, your Vice Chancellor. There's something there about positives.
Yeah, I think the great thing is, I think where I am currently, we have before I took the role, I was very careful about where I was going and who I was working with, because one of the things I'd like to touch on later is the mental health impact of almost internalizing these things over the years. And that is quite powerful. And for me, there's a Dr. Sally Jackson, who's Chief People Officer there, who I work with, and obviously Professor Sir Chris Husbands and other colleagues. They've been so open about, we want to make change, we want to deliver change, and they have done such a fantastic job up until now as well. And for me, it was, I'm going into an organisation with an open door here. That makes a huge difference, because I think you lose great talent if you don't. And for me, this is about talent management and, not losing those I call them uncut diamonds in an organisation, because they don't feel comfortable there.
So something you're saying there about the strength of the leadership and the culture. When you're saying that Sally said something, what would be an example of something that just gave you that feeling of acceptance?
Yeah, so for me, it's understanding that when you talk about delivering real substantial change, that the door is open, and you go on, do what you need to do to make this happen. And when you have that mandate, it is very, very powerful, because especially the higher education sector, it's very bureaucratic. It's run with lots of kind of challenges with regards to governance and so on. And actually, what I felt different about Sheffield Hallam is that it is go ahead and just crack on with it. If we feel we need to make change, let's go and do it. And it's a trust issue. I think it comes down to, yes, we trust you to go ahead and do this. Now, the conversations on race, so we are just launching on the back of this open conversations on race, which are going to be facilitated by a really great facilitator, a chap called Mayhay, who's an ex-chief senior police officer who's now in diversity and leadership. And I've said I want a no-holds-barred conversation. And for an organisation just to say, yeah, okay, let's do that, that's powerful.
So you're saying, I mean, really, not what I'm hearing here. It sounds like great leadership. It's about being empowered. It's about great leadership. It's just that you perhaps wouldn't expect to get that, or haven't. That feels, that shouldn't be dependent on the colour of your skin as whether you get great leadership or not. And I don't think they're doing that just because of the colour of your skin. That's just demonstrating good leadership.
It is, and I've worked in a number of organisations, and there have been pockets of good leadership, but they are a lone voice. And what I realised was people are saying the right things, but not doing the right things.
So was that an unconscious feeling? I'm just wondering, was there a sort of, sometimes you get a gut feel about whether people are insincere or something, or you'd see differences, you'd see contradictory behaviours? Yeah,
there is. I think it's difficult for me to say whether it's conscious or unconscious bias. Whether it's microaggressions or whether it's not microaggressions. That's the problem with this, you see, because you can't put your finger on it. So when you can't put your finger on it, it makes it very, very difficult. So what you end up doing is apologies for my little boy in the background, you end up actually causing yourself to have doubt on whether you are actually going to be successful or not.
Yeah, because it's almost, it goes back to that point we had about the manager. It might actually not be anything overt, but because you've had to experience it so long, and your point about maybe the well-being and that general impact, wearing down of your self-esteem, then maybe you start to think it's about you rather than about them. And then you don't feel able to go for the next opportunity. You don't feel worthy to the same extent, maybe because you've been worn down. That's...
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, if I'm being very, very honest, until I got this job, I was ready to throw in the towel and go into consultancy, because I just didn't want the organisational politics of it all. And luckily this came along, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do this, and it's a good decision.
How exciting. How exciting, as it really excites, really great. So, okay, so we've got some pieces here, and don't worry about noise in the background. We're all of this world, we accept that we're all working at home. And
I've given up trying to be professional at working from home for the last 14 weeks now.
I don't think it makes you any less professional. It just makes us more real, doesn't it? And that's maybe what we've needed in the workplace, to be more real conversations.
That's an interesting point, Lucinda, because I suppose that, again, I'm going to be very open and franco about this. I think, my experience has been, I'm not sure others, but when you are from a minority background, you are almost more inclined to think you've got to be more professional. You have to really make sure that everything is in line and perfect, because it will damage your career and so on. So these are the small things that, impact. I've over the years, I've most probably done so many hours additional to my contracted hours.
Yeah.
Because also I needed to make sure people saw that I was working hard.
Can I ask you, I don't know, sorry, Emma, don't carry on.
They're the things you just can't really explain in detail, but yeah, that's...
Can I ask you this, and maybe I'd have to ask someone. So some of what you say, and I think to a lesser extent, some of what you say, I think women experience some of it. I'm wondering if you are a BAME woman, is there a multiplier effect? Have you spoken to colleagues on that, or?
Absolutely. And intersectionality doesn't stop at just being somebody from a different background. You could have somebody who's BAME, a woman with a disability, and LGBT. I've got colleagues and friends such as that. So I think the discriminatory effect quadruples, doubles, quadruples. Gets worse. So I think that there's something around, specifically in the workplace. So if you have people with Islamophobia and people who wear headscarves. There was a point after 9/11, for example, where some of my friends and colleagues were so scared to go into work, thinking, well, I'm traveling into work with this, there's going to be a real problem here. I'm not going to get promoted, and so on and so on. And I think we'd be naive to think that there wasn't an element of truth in that, not everywhere, but certainly there would be somewhere.
Okay, so in terms of where you want to go, so we talked originally in terms of where we're taking this podcast. I think this is an interesting conversation. I hope the listeners as well. So thank you very much. What we want to do as ever is try and make it quite practical, and I think there are practicalities already that we're hearing in terms of just focusing on a strong quality leadership culture, leaders with good EQ, managers. Maybe teaching our line managers that they need to be able to give people good quality feedback about their development, whatever, they need to learn to do that, because if they don't, that person, particularly if they're a BAME candidate, they might actually interpret that as being about them as opposed to being about the manager being not so good. So there's a few things I'm thinking that are quite practical that you could almost support as an OD leader in an organisation. But what else would you say? Because you've got some great tips.
For me, I call it inclusive leadership. Old money would be EDI training, equality and diversity training. Talking years back would be gender equality training, race equality training. For me, I talk about inclusive leadership, and I think everybody can be an inclusive leader, regardless of whether you're in a management position or not. I've always looked for people. I've always looked for those quality leaders who made me feel part of the team, who included me, who made me feel, to a point safe, that you can, be part of that team openly. And for me, it's so important that if you don't have inclusive leaders, you have increased grievances, you have increased sickness, you have a reduction in productivity, and so on and so on. And I think that I don't think I think we underestimate the value of investing in this area to get people to become inclusive in their approach. And I always say that actually I see diversity as a business benefit, because, if you have people around the table who are different, women, BAME people, people with disabilities, you have richer decisions being made. My leadership team up until about 6 months ago was all women, and I always bounce ideas off them. For me, it is absolutely critical, because you've got that. I believe it's more measured sometimes in the decision making. So for me, I've always valued diversity. Not everybody else does. I think they like to surround themselves sometimes with people who are like them, who think like them. I think that's poor leadership.
Well, I personally think it's a sign of weakness, because people just want to reinforce their own ego, if you like, and don't want to encourage, or almost a sign of fear, someone who is actually a fearful leader, because then they want to reinforce how they are. Whether they do that consciously or not, I don't know. I've seen that in a few places, including schools, actually. But I can completely see that. Funny, I've just ran a webinar this morning on teams, and the whole principle of a team is difference, right? We're more effective. If the more diversity, the more effective you'll be as a team, to be perfectly honest. lower risk and all those things. So yes, I can definitely see that. So it's valuing that, and that's what you're saying. So Sheffield Hallam is a great case study you're seeing here in terms of doing that. That you've given us examples about how you're empowered to go and have these conversations. Do you want to talk about how one of those might work? How a challenging? Have you run any of those sessions yet?
No, not yet, but I've run them in other organisations, and I can give you an example. So, I won't mention where, but I ran a session once on microaggressions, racial microaggressions, and majority white audience, and they didn't feel comfortable talking about it. So we did this web chat type of thing where they could post questions, and they came up. This was when we were back, in pre-COVID, and some of the questions I was asked were, well, what about the white people who are getting, discriminated against? What about the white majority, and so on? And we answered those questions in a very positive way, because I think you need to take people with you on this journey. You cannot have the old style approach to banging people over the head with legislation. It hasn't worked up until now, and it's not about to start working now. But, if we do that. So for me, not using legislation as a driver, we've moved on, I think, from the business case, because I think the business case is established for diversity. What we need to understand is the business value of making sure this is done right. Because I think businesses have now started to realize and understand that if they don't have people who feel valued, they don't have people who feel included, it affects their business, regardless of whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. So for me, we've got to have a real focused approach to that. I have some clear ideas on what I think an inclusive leader is. That is my opinion. But a couple of those are, Lucinda, be open and aware. For me, a leader's ability to be able to adapt to behaviours and work situations and cultures, I think, are a foundation of a really great leader. I think that's really, really important. I think on the race equality agenda, don't feel guilty. Be an effective advocate of the race equality agenda. And what I mean by that is, don't be afraid to ask some of the questions that everybody wants to ask. The majority want to ask, but are just too afraid to ask. Or potentially they will be labelled a racist or a sexist or homophobe. Sometimes you've just got to be brave enough to ask those.
Or actually they're scared of saying the wrong thing. I mean, as well, because to a certain extent, we were talking about off camera, weren't we, about the experience I've got at home. I've got a 16-year-old daughter, and we've been reading Invisible Women, and it's led to some challenge in the household to dad, who's okay to a point, and also granddad, who happens to be locked down with us. And there are very different opinions. And what we've got to be careful about is that kind of accusatory approach, because that doesn't, your point about bringing people with you, it's no point in holding people to blame. This blame doesn't take us anywhere. And I think that people then start to fight back if they feel threatened. So it's really helping to be inclusive and open.
It is. And I think it's about not being afraid to hear some difficult things. When we talk about white privilege, people suddenly just go into a frenzy sometimes.
Here's the question, but what's the right answer then? So, I mean, I'm reading at the moment why I won't talk to white people about that. Would it's great, very well written actually. I've forgotten the title now, but I'm reading it at the moment. But there is this thing where then people feel a bit guilt. We feel bad because we don't want to live in a society like that. Many of us don't want that to be the case. But then we're not quite sure what the right response is. Almost a bit like if you talk to someone being bereaved. People have different illnesses. Sorry, this is probably a really bad example. But we have different. Sometimes you don't know what the right response is to somebody. I'd love to know what is the right thing to say to someone who says, actually, you've got white privilege, I haven't, and what is an appropriate response?
That is such an interesting question, isn't it? I think people see that as a different everybody sees that in a different way. So when I first heard the phrase, I thought, whoa, well, that's a bit aggressive, isn't it? But then the more I've read into it, it's not about saying, there is white privilege. So anybody who's white, who's have had the silver spoon in their mouth, they might get a little bit defensive. So hang on a second, I've worked really hard to get to where I am, and you most probably have. Mm. The challenge here is the white privilege element is when you walk into a room, you do not have the barrier, first of all, of not being white. Mm. So this kind of pretense around structurally over the years that, that's been ingrained in people's mind through advertising, through films, through media, through so on, it's even ingrained in BAME, people from BAME backgrounds. You see, sadly, a group of, BAME kids, for example, in hoodies, and you're walking down a dark night, straight away in your head, you're going to think, well, there's something. But actually, is that bias kicking in? I don't know. But the white privilege element is such that people need to understand that it's not about them. It's not personal. Yeah. This is about structural racism that's been around for years. And basically what's happened over the last 3 weeks, I've not seen this before. And I've been involved in this for years. I did a role at the Home Office, which was directly in response to a BBC documentary that came out, which was a panorama documentary around police being racist, undercover police being racist. And as a result, they put together a team that formed the Race Equality Programme for the whole of the police service. I led that at the Home Office with the Association of Chief Police Officers. And I didn't feel that feeling then. So that's why I think over the last 3 weeks, and my blog said, are we at a tipping point? So I think we are, because you've got people protesting out there of all colours. Mm. And it's fantastic. And you've got places in Denmark, Germany, all of Europe. I've not seen that before. Mm. That's why I think we are at a tipping point.
So then how can we take it forward positively and would like to see society to be more equal? Is that an appropriate response? We want to work together to level the playing field.
I think this is about this is a really difficult one because it's such a wide spectrum of issues. Yeah. From structural racism in the police service, to people having it ingrained in their mind that white privilege for me is, if you drive a nice car, are you going to be stopped and searched by the police?
Yeah.
The likelihood is no, unless something's wrong with your car. If you are Black, Afro-Caribbean or Asian and you are driving a nice car, was there likely that you could be stopped? Yes. I'm from a professional background. I drive a decent car and I've been stopped on a number of occasions. So there is something in the system. I think when you look at employment, if we're talking about HR,
yeah,
are our HR systems geared up to understand the different cultures that we've got? As HR leaders, are we really challenging behaviours that we would inside think this is not right? But because the organisation is saying, no, this person's a problem, get this person out because they're challenging or whatever they're doing. I think that's where the difference comes in. Because I think if you have teams, and I would please say my team at Hallam thinks diversely because I've said I will not accept anything else. Mm. That may be that they challenge me and say, you're making the wrong decision here. And that's absolutely fine. But that means as a leader, you've got to be open enough to be able to think in a different way. And I think over the years, that's not happened. So you'll have people from Black and Asian backgrounds going through a higher prevalence of disciplinaries. or at a quicker rate. You will have a lot more people from BAME backgrounds potentially getting shortlisted, but then it drops off like a cliff edge when it comes to appointments. You will have less BAME staff, if I take the example of the NHS, being very much concentrated in the very middle, lower management jobs. You start going into the higher bandings, and that's it, they become non-existent.
Plus, you have quite a high proportion in there as well, don't you? So it's definitely statistically significant.
Yeah, absolutely. If you take London and Tower Hamlets as an example, you just across the road from the capital finance of this country, in London, you've got Tower Hamlets, which is extremely high proportion of Bangladeshi communities. How many of those communities actually go and work in the city? You cross the point and go into the city, and you'll see hardly any, apart from cleaning and facility staff. So there is disproportionality. We just need to be acceptable to it and say that we're going to challenge it.
And from a practical point of view, if you're in an HR role, you could just keep an eye on the statistics and be prepared to challenge the hiring managers and say, or the manager who's asking for performance management, and say, what is the reason? Make sure that, and ask people to challenge themselves. Is this genuinely on performance? Is it a level playing field that I am measuring against? Which, of course, in HR, we would all say it should be. Anyway, you should have clear criteria that are about behaviours, not subjective. But we know, again, maybe it does come round to ensuring we have good quality processes, recruitment and performance management processes in our organisation, and we make sure that our managers have the skills to carry them out cleanly. And a part of that is making sure that they are detaching their natural bias from a process, and so we can maybe challenge that in terms of our processes.
That's so difficult, Lucinda, because I believe that everybody has biases. We are all human, regardless of what background we're from. We all have biases, and some of the possibly biases that the bias that some communities from the BAME community have towards other BAME communities are also prevalent. And I think, I'm not naive enough not to think that exists. I think the challenge here is, what do we do as HR professionals to challenge that? And there's not many really out there who are HR OD professionals, but also diversity professionals. You either have a diversity professional or a HR professional. Some might mix the two. But really, shouldn't we be making sure that all our HR people are really up to speed on diversity, and not just the legislative part? I'm not talking about making sure we stay out of employment tribunals or making sure employment legislation.
But championing it.
Championing it, absolutely. And we are in such a powerful position. All HR people are, because managers out there, good managers and poor managers, rely on HR to make sure that they're following process and doing the right thing.
And again, maybe the loop back here is to how we could do it in a better way is, if we did see that 10%, that the proportions are out, keep an eye on the data to see where there is, but then the way you challenge it is in a supportive way. What are the criteria to coach people? That we don't need to assume that it is racism. It's to coach people as, actually, are you being objective in your decision making? Full stop. Because there is other bias. They might like one person and not like another person. There are other ways in which that happens. So it's helping people to be better at being objective.
I'm wanting to be more radical now, if I'm being honest, because I've done that for 20 years. Yeah. And
so you say call it out?
Well, I've coached the hell out of people. It's right. For me, why did we get a shift in the makeup of the FTSE 100 boards of women? Or we're getting there. Why have we got, and it's great to see senior women in such fantastic positions of influence in organizations, because, we've introduced, targets, we've introduced real driving positive action initiatives to make that happen. If you look at the House of Commons, you see the makeup as it was to 20 years ago. Wow, different, in both ethnicity and female representation. When we come to talk about targets on race, suddenly everybody gets a little bit uncomfortable. Suddenly we start to think, whoa, hang on a second. We don't want to give people jobs because they're BAME. I agree. You should only get the job if you are qualified, up to speed, etc.
Is that because, though, people, this is almost like the elephant in the room, but the reality is that almost by saying there's a difference in your skin colour is inferring that we're racist, because they're pretending that everything's fine and it's neutral, but actually to then go, no, we should have targets in that area. People, do you understand what I'm trying to say? Put me out of my misery.
No. I know before we started this, I said, we should not be afraid to ask these difficult questions.
Yeah.
For me, especially all my colleagues who I've worked with over the years, start to apologise. But no, this is exactly what we should be doing. We should be having these uncomfortable yet comfortable conversations, And the way I see it is this. It's quite simple. It's about levelling the playing field.
Yeah.
The playing field is not level. If we look at all the data, it points to the point that the playing field isn't level. We only have to look at COVID-19, and we look at the disproportionate impact of BAME people who have been affected and who have died. An example of this is, and I've noticed it because I noticed, I have Facebook and I have notifications of, when there's deaths in the community or whatever. And every day there has been people dying from this who I know, and I just think, wow, this is bizarre. So there is health inequalities for BAME people. And, when I was working in the NHS, I got a report once which really made me sit down and almost put me in tears. It says if you are somebody from a South Asian background and you are a mother going to give birth, you are 3 times more likely to die giving birth. This is in 2018. That was the statistics then, and it's still the same now. So, I look at that in my context of my family, I think, does that mean my daughter is really at that risk? Why? Yeah. Why is that the case? So when I talk about employment, you only have to look at representation. In the higher education sector, I can only look at, in my organisation, and this is where we have got some way to go. I'm the only BAME director in an organisation of over 5,000 staff. So, yes, we're going in the right direction, but my God, we've got a long way to go. And I think you in the blog, Lucinda, I pointed at the start to my daughter, and you mentioned your daughter, and I think it's really important to say we were in an area that was predominantly white, very nice area. The amount of racist abuse she got, this was last year, in her second year in secondary school, and the school doing nothing about it led me to move house.
Yeah.
And I think to myself, things can't remain like that.
No.
So I think there is something around structural racism, which is the system. And old money, it would be institutional racism, what it was called. I think first point is accepting that it does exist. And I think organizations are so afraid to accept that it actually exists due to the fear of them having a negative impact on their reputation. I think it's strong leadership. I think it's great leadership when people say, we have got a problem. Now let's try and find a solution.
Yeah, exactly. You can only do that as when you admit you've got the problem, can you fix it? So,
absolutely.
And it's not about, and it's not your fault. It's not one person's fault. It's the way things have been for years and years and years. So how do we admit it, face it, and fix it?
Yeah. And the thing for me is this is about having ambassadors for change. And this is not about whether you're BAME, white, whatever colour. It doesn't make absolute jot bit of difference to me, really. It matters if you've got the right intentions to deliver the change.
Yeah.
I suppose this is a call out to all HR colleagues who might hear this, that, you're in such a great position to influence change. And I think you mentioned your daughter having these robust conversations. Generations are changing. And I think people are more used to diversity. People are getting more used to thinking, well, what is going on here? There's nothing wrong with this. So I think if HR doesn't adjust now, we're going to start to have organisations that aren't great places for people who want to come and work there.
Yeah. And the young generation want to come through with a change. They want all this to change. So we can enable that as people come in as well. I think that's, we've talked and we could go on. I think that's probably quite a strong place to end on, isn't it? As being the champions of change, remembering we've got both the responsibility and the opportunity to make a difference. All the classic stuff is still the same, good stuff, leadership, etc., but calling people out. And I heard your point, which was about the soft way of doing it has been and gone. Well, there's balance. I'm not saying be aggressive and set people up against each other, because we don't need that either. But actually just being straight and calling people out and with the facts is not a bad thing to do.
If it's okay, I'd like to finish with just 3 points, I think, which would be helpful. Again, which actually my Vice Chancellor, Chris Husbands, challenged me to do, to say, where can we improve more? And I was like, oh, that's fantastic, because I was trying to be quite balanced. And so there's 3 things. I think in your organisations, don't paper over the cracks on race equality. Do not dilute the situation with, as soon as it comes, people feel quite uncomfortable and they end up talking about other protected groups, which is not saying it's not important, but we must focus on one thing in order to solve a problem first before we try and resolve everything else. The second thing is take an authentic stance against racial discrimination. Don't be afraid to open up the debate. Don't be afraid to invest, even at a time when organizations are looking to retract their kind of spending. This is one area I would say you will regret it if you decide to take this down. So really, really try and drive that up. And finally, challenge your own privilege. You don't have to do that in front of everybody. You can do it while you listen to music in your car, driving to work whenever we do go back. But try to understand the hurt, the challenge that people who are different from you go through. And that might be as simple as saying, I'm going to have a coffee with somebody that I would never normally have a coffee with. And just have a conversation about life. And for me, that's the best equality training you can get.
Yeah.
But, to finish on the Black Lives Matter thing, I just felt there was this debate going on around all lives matter. And actually, I agree with it. I absolutely, why wouldn't you agree with that? But I don't think you can agree with that fully until you realise that all lives do truly matter. That includes no matter what background you're from.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if we can come from that perspective, then I think we'll be doing well and making change.
Let's hope this is the tipping point and progress for the future. It's quite exciting. If people wanted to connect with you or get in touch with you, how would they find you?
If they can connect with me on LinkedIn. So if you just search my name, Umar Zamman.
We'll put your LinkedIn in the notes actually as well.
Please do connect with me. And it's got all my details there, my email and everything. More than happy to have a conversation with anybody. I think for me, this is more than a job. I think we should be doing this across the board. And and important to note that I am a champion for all equality. This just happens to be I'm talking about race equality.
Yeah. And maybe you can help other people have that experience and sort of
absolutely.
create that ripple effect.
I'm more than happy to have conversations with you to have this discussion. It's much overdue.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on, Umar. It's been great. As I said before, guys, we will put links in the show notes to Umar, to his blog. And I really encourage you to reach out and see if there's a way of a network of positivity that people can support each other when they're not quite sure how to do it. There's lots of standalone HR people in smaller businesses too. That's tricky in different ways. Sometimes they find it hard to approach their leadership. That's a whole other story. But I think it'd be great if we can get some group of people together to support each other in moving this forward. Thank you so much for coming on, Umar.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast. You can access more information, including resources or links mentioned in the show, at our website, www.hruprising.com. Also, you might want to join our LinkedIn community or tweet to us at HR Uprising. We'd love to hear from you.